I want to kick things off by sharing with you some information about our moderator. Ty Lin came to Northeastern by way of Miramar, Florida. Ty has an impressive resume. She's the academic chair of the Black Law Student Association, a former lawyering fellow, and a research assistant for Judge Blitzman, and a former student investigator for the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Clinic. She's also an active member of the First Generation Society and served on the Committee Against Institutional Racism, Diversity Inclusion Committee, and NUSL's Criminal Justice Task Force. A recent graduate from the University of Central Florida, Ty also served as an AmeriCorps member with service year at an elementary school in Washington, D.C. Ty, thank you for sharing your time and energy with us today. My apologies. Ty will be interviewing our inspirational guest, Paul Francisco. As the Chief Diversity Officer and Head of Workforce Development Programs at State Street Corporation, Paul is a changemaker in diversity, equity, belonging, and inclusion strategies, not only in global corporations, but also in community development at the local and state level. Paul truly values the power of community. He is a co-founder of the professional association, The Dinner Group, which led demonstrations over the summer in Boston and continued support of the Black Lives Matter movement. Paul has continued to encourage his colleagues and peers to advocate for racial equity, and he was appointed by Governor Charlie Baker to serve on the Black Advisory Board Commission. Aside from many accolades and partnerships, Paul is also a proud father, and we cannot be more excited to have him here with us today. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Diana.
Ty, I'll hand the interview over to you for our questions, and we'll assist with the audience Q&A afterwards.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Diana. And so nice to see you, Paul. Happy to be here with you all. And to go ahead and kick us off, Paul, in an interview with WBUR this past August, he spoke about the trend in hiring diversity and inclusion positions in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests. As your resume proves, this is not a new role. Can you give us an insight on how this industry has changed throughout the social justice movements of your career?
Thank you, Ty, and thank you to the Alumni Association for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So thank you for spending the time. You know, I've been in diversity management and inclusion for the last 20 plus years, and this is a pivotal time for us. I have never seen the energy, the effort, the focus, and the action that has taken place since last summer. Unfortunately. And so I like to say that this is the best of times for someone in my position in terms of managing and dealing with issues of equity, inclusion, and diversity, but it's also the worst of times because it's taken us this long as a society, it's taken us this long as a country and as organizations and corporations to really kind of truly look at the issues of racism and structurally try to dismantle them. And, you know, in a way you feel powerless sometimes because you realize how hairy, how messy, how insidious this has been in all levels of society for many years. So, you know, what I've seen, it's a lot of companies and organizations obviously came out with statements post George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, you know, Sandra Bland and others. But George Floyd was sort of the catalyst. You know, part of it was they were horrified at what's happening. Those 8 minutes and 46 seconds really were ingrained in people's consciousness. And you saw this wave of energy come forth, right? And statements in support of the concept of Black Lives Matter. And you know, and which was great to see. And it's great to see the allyship in action since then. What I think was missing prior to that was organizations having really deep and honest and transparent discussions around what equity is, what it looks like in their organizations, and what do we need to do about it. Luckily at State Street, we had begun those conversations in earnest, I would say a couple of years prior to this happening, conversations about racism and what that means, allyship between our Black professionals group and We have an Italian Americans professionals group, a Irish professionals group, and we have 24 networks at State Street. So we have all kinds of affinities, networks, including religious networks that have come together to try to solve for some of these issues. So I'm encouraged by what I see. I think that there's, it's been 7 months since those incidents. They haven't stopped, right? This unfortunately have continued. And so, what I'm looking forward to and what I've seen that is different is that now the private sector is sort of saying, you know what, we're not the only ones that will be able to solve this on our own. We need government, we need not-for-profits, NGOs, we need thought leadership and action leadership to change this. So I've seen some systemic approaches, some collaborative approaches that really I think are going to work, that are different from what I've seen before. And I see which I think is the difference this time around, our white allies actually coming to be a part of it, right? To not be bystanders and to really say, all right, so what do I need to do personally? How do I understand what my role is in this space, and how do I respectfully enter this space in order to be an ally, right? And in order to really drive change, because I have the influence, I have the privilege, I have the power in many cases to be a catalyst for change.
And Paul, one of the things that you mentioned is these various statements. And so we've heard a lot, especially during this climate, about diversity and inclusion, but what would you say diversity and inclusion means to you?
So, I like to think of diversity, inclusion, but also, I like to throw in the equity and belonging pieces of it, right? And simply stated, I always think of it this way. Simply stated, and a really good friend of mine, Renee Myers, talks about, diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to the dance floor. I like to say, well, equity is being asked to, or belonging is actually being actively asked to co-create the playlist for the DJ, right? And equity is where everybody gets in for free, or everybody pays the same, right? And everybody is able to enjoy it the same way. So, when you talk about diversity and inclusion, really, diversity is really just kind of like the table stakes, right? Do you have enough people that are representation of the greater society, the greater world, of what you want to see? And that is not exclusive of just race and gender. I mean, there's so many different dimensions of inclusion and diversity that we need to consider, right? And so do you have enough of that? Inclusion is, how do those people feel? Do they have a voice when they are there, wherever there is, at the perennial table, right? Do they have a voice? Do they feel that they can, say what's on their minds? Include and belonging is around that feeling that this is mine, right? I belong here, and I can, in fact, I'm an owner, right? I'm an active participant. My opinion matters and is being sought after. And the equity piece is, feeling that everything is fair and just, or feeling that there is a process whereby fairness and justice is actually in practice, in the processes, in the decision making, and how people get rewarded. And how people have access, right, or not, and whether people are actually advancing at the same rate as others, right? Whether it's in greater society, whether it's around health outcomes, whether it's around economic opportunity, jobs, or whether it's inside organizations in terms of career mobility, in terms of visibility, et cetera. So I think that's how I look at it. They're all complement each other, should complement each other. They all play a different role in the spectrum, if you will, in the continuum of seeking to be at a place where you have just organizations and societies, cities. And so, but we are a long ways away from achieving that, right? I literally can't think of a company or a city or an organization that has really figured it out, right? And if you look around, when you think of Boston, 4 years ago when the study came out from the Federal Reserve that talked about the color of wealth. Boston was the second most inequitable city in the country. Yet we think of ourselves as so progressive. We think of ourselves as so just and, even, dare I say it, diverse, right? Because we're a 54% now majority city, that we think that we are better than we are. And in fact we are probably, from an equity perspective, one of the least equitable places, right? There's a lot of wealth that is accumulated here, but how many of us have true access to that economic well-being, that security, that feeling of safety and wellness, and that feeling of opportunity?
I didn't know that about Boston. That's just crazy. And one of the things that you mentioned, Paul, was just the importance of listening. And so in an interview with WorkHuman, you encourage leaders to really listen to what employees are asking for, to really think differently about how to solve these challenges. Can you share an example of how State Street has done that, and how have they provided change?
Yeah. So this is, when it comes to this work, you cannot, in my opinion, humble opinion, you cannot begin to really understand what the issues are if you haven't taken the time to actively listen to those folks who don't have a voice, to invite those folks to have a voice, and to reflect on what you heard, and to reflect on, again, what role you play in that, personally, professionally, in that space. And so, at State Street, we have a lot of smart people, right? We are a company of 40,000 people. We are the 9th largest financial services institution in the world. A lot of people don't realize this. 10% of the world's economy flows through State Street on a daily basis. I mean, that's a significant. We are what is called a globally significant bank, a bank for banks, if you will. And so, there are a lot of smart people. There are a lot of accomplished people, and they feel that they know, that they know a lot, right? And when it comes to this work, you have to be humble. You have to have a sense of humility about what you don't know, about what you haven't not been exposed to, about what you have not experienced. And so we always talk to people about, thinking about walking a mile on somebody else's shoes, right? And while you may not be able to get the complete full experience, you certainly can develop empathy for some other conditions. We actually have Professor Cogburn that's coming to talk to State Street next week about that 1,000-cut journey, right? It's a virtual immersion experience of a Black man, right? A 20-some-year-old Black man. And what does that feel? And it's a virtual reality thing. And it's called a journey of 1,000 cuts. Those are listening moments organizationally where you as an organization need to understand and realize that perhaps not everything we're doing is working, or is working to the level that we want it to work. We have to work with leaders, right? Leaders are managers at State Street have a special duty and responsibility to understand their teams, their people, and understand that not everyone comes through the doors, and now in these days, the virtual doors of State Street, with the same experiences, with the same opportunities, and they have to be able to manage and meet people where they are. But a lot of that comes from active listening, from understanding, from, again, taking your own perceptions and even value system, not applying it to others, understanding how your value system might actually be, in fact, biased, and it might be, I would say that your value system may not be necessarily inclusive. And you have to understand what you need to do in order to fix that. And that all starts with listening, with understanding, and developing this framework where you say, you know what, I'm going to listen, I'm going to process the information, and then I'm going to act, right? So I'm going to go from the fear zone of what I don't know into the learning zone, get myself comfortable, get myself educated, get myself coached, mentored, and then into the action zone, which is that growth mindset that we all need.
I totally agree. I think listening is incredibly important, and so it's really nice to hear that State Street is doing that. And on that note, Paul, what are some steps that you're seeing other employers take in regards to diversity and inclusion initiatives? And are there steps that you find particularly effective, or have you seen things that aren't effective? And what could these employers do to make them more effective?
Yeah, so I think, again, back to actually your first question, right, as to how things have changed. I think, and to tie it to this is what I've seen work is when you have a framework, when you actually are intentional about putting together a framework that says, here's where we are in terms of this work, inclusion, diversity, and equity, and here's where we want to get to. And what are the things organizationally that we need to work on, right? So we have a framework at State Street that it's like a 5-pillar framework that talks about communication, what we say, how we say it, who says it, right? And just a frame, a way in which we all agree that language matters, and that how we want to communicate why this work is so important and critical, not only for the moral code and the moral fabric of our organization in terms of our cultural values, but because it actually drives value, right? It actually makes us a higher performing organization. It actually gives us a competitive advantage when it comes to talent, when it comes to business engagements, clients, market share. I'm actually speaking a lot more to clients nowadays, stakeholders, shareholders, right? Because they want to know what we do and how we're doing it. So communication is a big piece of that. So the second part of that framework is around the pipeline, right? The diversity, the representation. Do you have the right strategies, the right partnerships, the right approaches? Are the people who are out there seeking talent for your organization representative of the talent that you want to seek, right? Do they look like the talent that you're looking to seek? Et cetera. Then you have the accountability part, right? The third component of it is accountability. Who's responsible at the end of the day? Who's going to be held accountable for making progress or not, right? So all our leaders at State Street have a diversity, inclusion, and equity goal, performance priority that they have to achieve and live by. Our most senior leaders have a scorecard, right, that talks about 18 different types of human capital metrics that we capture, including diversity goals, how we're doing against representation, retention, of talent, even how we exiting talent to make sure that they're doing the right thing. And by the way, there is a monetary either reward or compensation if you achieve or not, or don't achieve those diversity goals. So that works. I've seen that work. What I've seen not work is when companies don't do that. The fourth component is really around coaching, developing, education. We always required our leaders be inclusive leaders. We required that of all of our colleagues. But do we give them the tools to do so? Do we give them the tools to make it safe for them to understand what that process is like, to make them safe for them to understand? That is a learning, just as we learned and we're socialized to be racist as a society. And by the way, we, meaning even Black people, can be racist, right? Latinx people can be racist, as a matter of fact. So we all were socialized in a way that racism and racist sort of behaviors were part of it. So in the same way, we can actually be deprogrammed, and we can be, we can be mentor coached to become anti-racist, right? So we have a strategy around that, and how do we get people there? And then lastly, what I've seen, and this is a newer part of the corporate structure. This is more prevalent, let's say, in the not-for-profit world, but the concept of equity and justice is now embedded into what companies should be thinking about and should be doing, because it's not enough to stop at representation or inclusion, but really thinking about equity. And so what does equity look like, right? When you look at, who gets rewarded, who gets picked for assignments, who gets promoted, who gets selected to serve on executive committees or on boards, et cetera. analyzing those processes, making sure that there isn't a bias there, and that we have fair systems. Who gets paid? How do they get paid? Compared to their peers, is all part of the equity that we're seeking to build. So if you have those things, I've seen that work. If you have that framework, if you don't have that framework, and if you think of this work as just, okay, well, this is another initiative that we're going to do, and we're going to do it because everybody's talking about it, but we're not really serious about what the long-term sustainability of this is, or that this is part of our business. This is our core part of who we are and what we should be thinking about as a business in order to be competitive. That's what I've seen fail.
Thank you, Paul. Just to pause real quickly, I'm hearing that a couple of people aren't able to hear me. Paul, are you able to hear me okay?
Yeah, well, you're coming a little low, but that's okay.
Okay, we're gonna roll with it. I'm sorry, everybody. We're rolling with the tech here. Paul, one of the things that really stands out to me about the work that you've done and the awareness that you've built around diversity and inclusion is the protest that you had outside of Faneuil Hall. So this past June, you and the dinner group, a professional men and women of color network, you co-founded, organized a silent protest in front of a historical city landmark with ties to the slave trade, and you and dozens of members stood for 90 minutes in 90 degrees heat, mostly in professional suits and holding signs calling for justice for the Black Lives Taken. Can you talk about the planning behind that? And even to speak to what was running through your mind as you were protesting in front of what is called the Cradle of Liberty?
So, you're taking me back to a very emotional time, right? If you think about it, it was towards the end of June. There was a global uproar around what has happened, what had happened, what was happening. And different people were trying to process it, differently, right? That the whole country's attention was sort of focused on the protests, what was happening in all the different cities. This actually came up really quickly. The young gentleman you see on the right there, Emerson Foster, is really the brains behind the dinner group. This started close to 20 years ago. A small number of us started getting together, men of color, just to find community, to be able to connect to each other in an authentic way. So we used to host these small dinners, and then eventually it grew into a larger group. We now have chapters in Atlanta. We have a chapter actually in Charlotte that launched last year. The Providence Men's Dinner Group just launched a couple of months ago, and we have Boston, and we have actually a couple other chapters around the country that are waiting to get online. So I got a call from Emerson on a Thursday, I think it was, and he said, "Hey, P, what are we going to do?" Right? We are not an advocacy group. We are not a activist group. We had never done such a thing. But we knew that we had a responsibility to act and to do something. And, many of us individually had taken either part on a protest or whatever the case was. And we came up with this idea. Why don't we, send an email to the men, whoever shows up, shows up. But we wanted to make a statement that we didn't have to shout and scream that the names of the deceased, the name of the killed, and you see DJ Henry's name. I worked with Dan Henry, his father, at Fleetback back in the day, he HR executive, and a lot of these names are local, right? And we just said, yeah, let's do it. We sent out an email. 150 men and women and allies showed up. We wanted to, it was a somber moment. We wanted to make sure that we recognize the seriousness of the moment that we were going through. And when we decided to stand in Faneuil Hall facing City Hall, it wasn't intended to be this in your face statement. It was just more, what can we do to call attention to this? And this is in the middle of the pandemic, right? So we were standing in Faneuil Hall, again, named after a slave owner, and facing City Hall, the place where a lot of the busing sort of demonstrations and not riots, but had taken place, where many of us witness the picture or know the picture of a well-known leader in the community, professor, getting stabbed with the American flag. And it was, I would tell you, it was a very emotional, almost out of body experience where we're standing there silently for 90 minutes, holding these names, the signs, people honking their horns and clapping and stopping by and taking pictures. But really, me crying, I was crying, and I was just feeling as a man of color in America, how do we get here? How do we get to this point? And what do we do to change it? It got a lot of attention, Boston Globe, Boston Business Journal, and picked up by even by outlets outside of Boston. And it was just our way of saying we can do something. We can do something individually and collectively. So it became an activist moment without necessarily us thinking that it was. And it was just a very powerful day to have 150 men, young men, young kids, as you look on the left, come in and join us for that day.
Just looking at the images, it seems like a very, very powerful time. And so thank you for sharing that and the planning that went behind it, Paul. And even too, just thinking about your other efforts with dismantling systemic racism throughout Massachusetts. You were one of the founders of the New Commonwealth Racial Equity and Social Justice Fund, which is a coalition of Massachusetts Black and Brown executives. And with a fundraising goal of 100 million, the fund will work towards these efforts of dismantling racism. And so how do you see this collaborative philanthropy disrupting racist institutions?
So, the little known fact and the reason why we came together, again, right, around June of last year, all of us individually thinking, what can we do? And I got a call from Damian Wilmot, who is a senior leader at Vertex, a friend of mine. He said, Paul, we need to do something. What can we do? And we started chatting. He just came up and said, hey, you know what? At the very least, let's get other professionals that we know. And that's how the 19 came to be. Dr. Maisha Minter Jordan, Mo Cowan, the head of GE. We have Pam Everhart, Damien Hart, General Counsel, Liberty Mutual, you name it. We have, a lot of folks who are leaders within their own right and in their own organizations. And the idea that came out of that was, well, if we are senior leaders in our organizations, why don't we go to our organizations, directly to our CEOs, and ask what are they willing to do to help dismantle structural racism? We have an idea, and we want to create this fund because only 2% of philanthropic dollars in the Commonwealth go to Black and Brown-led organizations, right? And that is racist in and of itself. Why is it that only white-led organizations are considered good enough to drive change in the Commonwealth? And we wanted to change that, and we wanted to change the dynamics of how philanthropy is done. And we set out to have this. Our initial goal wasn't 100 million. Our initial goal was 20 million. And since June so far, we've actually raised 30 million. We already had our first round of funding to 20 very well deserving organizations who are doing absolutely amazing work all throughout the Commonwealth. We wanted to focus on all 351 towns, but we wanted to start with towns with predominantly Black and Latinx population. And, and we gave out $1 million back in October. We're about to do our second round where we're targeting hopefully closer to $5 million money going out directly to these organizations. Trust-based philanthropy. We don't want these organizations to have to jump through hoops. This Black and Brown leaders have to do all kinds of things to try to get funding from the traditional philanthropy channels in Boston, which are mostly, 90+% white-led. And we wanted to create something that was for us, by us. We, individually contributed to the fund as well. But we were fortunate enough to have our organizations backing us up. So State Street invested $5 million into the creation of the fund. So did Eastern Bank. And then the other 19 organizations that we represent did the same thing. Not the same amounts, but certainly significant amounts. And so far we've raised close to $30 million. We just got the largest individual donation from Mr. Kraft, Robert Kraft, from his family foundation. And the Players Coalition gave us another $250,000, which is the NFL players themselves that was matched by the Patriots Foundation. So we're marching towards our $100 million goal. The goal is to put a dent into the issues of systemic racism and equity in Massachusetts. Proud to say that since the inception of the fund in June, there have been other funds that have been created similar in mirroring our fund and inspired by us. One in Canada, there are 51 Black and Brown executives that came together in Canada to create a Canadian Black Fund. There's another one in Colorado. There's another one in Houston. And there's one recently in California that is actually a collection of funders that came together in Silicon Valley to drive systemically try to drive racism. We have 4 pillars to the work that we do around police reform, which is critically important. And you saw the recent bill that was signed by Governor Baker, around health equities and making sure that, not only do we have enough vaccine centers in our communities, which have been the most impacted, but that we are looking at the long-term health and wellness of our communities. And what do we do there? We're looking at youth education and empowerment. And then we're also looking at economic empowerment. What can we do to drive economic growth, jobs, and opportunity for those communities? So that's what we're doing. And we have a $100 million goal, a lofty goal. So we're hopefully we'll get there soon.
I'm hopeful that you will get there as well. It seems like you all are definitely making waves in terms of what you all are able to raise thus far. So it's only the beginning. And then Paul, you raised a really important piece of the conversation, which is thinking about promoting Black communities' economic prosperity and well-being. And so you were recently appointed by Governor Charlie Baker to the Black Advisory Board Commission. And so what immediate changes do you believe needs to happen in order to continue with this hopeful move towards systemic change?
Well, one immediate change is for us, meaning government, corporate, and not-for-profits to really sit at the table and figure out and actually start from scratch. Like clearly everything we're doing is not working, or everything we have done so far is not working. If you are paying attention, there was just a recent study that came out that says that the city of Boston discriminated against small businesses in terms of contracts, right? And only 1.2% of city contracts went to minority-owned businesses. Clearly, things are not working. Clearly, things aren't equitable. And so what do we do? What do we need to do? And we need to have those serious discussions. So we need to start from, from a blank sheet of paper and figure out and have people who are invested, who are proximate to the issues, be part of that discussion. You can't just have it at the cabinet level, both in the Charlie Baker's government and in the last few days of Mayor Walsh's reign. It has to be a collective effort. It has to be transparent. We have to agree that the things that we put in place have not worked, and that's partly the route we took with State Street, where we came out with 10 action plan. And we are sort of looking at everything from scratch and saying, clearly things aren't working equitably. So how do we do it differently? And so that's for me the basics, right? If you can't admit that things aren't working for a certain group of people, certain groups of people, then we're never going to get to a solution. And as painful as that may be, I think that that's what's really necessary and needed. And we need to move swiftly, right? Because I think many of us and many of you on this call are just sort of tired of hearing the same old rhetoric around, yeah, of course it's important. Of course, we're trying to address it. But what are the actual outcomes, right? The fact that in December, I think it was, the only 5% of the Black and Latinx population had been vaccinated compared to the rest of the, I mean, how is that possible? Right? If we are the communities who are mostly impacted. So why wasn't it that we didn't think that these were the communities that should have priority, right? And now we're doing a little bit better, but simple things that a lot of people take for granted in their everyday existence, we have to, scratch and kick and fight for to have the same right. And it's just really, just give us a level playing field. Just be fair. And I think that needs to happen, but we need to just design everything from the ground up.
I agree, Paul. We have a lot of work to do, but we're definitely at least starting and bringing that awareness around it. And I have many more questions that I can ask you, but I do want to open it up to the audience. But before I do that, Paul, one question that I want to leave you with is, what is the best way for a coworker, no matter the title or the position? We have an audience from all different backgrounds, but what can we do to bring diversity and inclusion practices into our workplaces or any environment?
Take personal accountability. Take personal accountability. That's figure out where you stand on the issue, if you have a stance or not, and if you do, what have you done about it? What is the one thing that you've done to show that you are an ally? What is the one thing you've done that is courageous, that has challenged the system, that has questioned the system? Are you just a bystander, right? Are you comfortably, sitting in your, warm living room with a great meal every evening with a glass of wine, looking at the news, looking at what's happening in Roxbury, Dorchester, East Boston, you're saying, wow, poor people, I feel for them. But what have you done to change the condition, to help change the condition, right? So I think just taking personal accountability and doing an inventory of when was the last time you had a conversation with someone that didn't look like you, to try to have an honest discussion as to, what can you do, right? Because we kind of tired of, and this happened right after June, right? A lot of people reached out. How are you feeling? How are you doing? What can I do, right? Which is great. Don't get me wrong. And I had, but I would say, so what are you willing to do? How are you going to get out of your comfort level? Many of my colleagues, right, who are, live in Wellesley and, Weston and all the W's, right? Winchester, and then you throw in Needham, not Needham, Hingham, and all those different towns. I said, what are you willing to do? All right. Are you having conversations with your sons and daughters, with your partners, spouses, with your friends, right? And when you reach out to someone, reach out with this, again, the sense of humility. Hey, listen, I just want to touch base with you, check in, see how things are going. I see what's happening. What can I do, right? And yes, there's a little bit of we Black and brown people have to accept that, right? Welcome that, and then we can, okay, what can we do together? Right. So personal accountability, I think, is going to be a big part of how things are going to change. And if each one of us, 69, 70 people who are on this call decide to do something, one thing, right, to either get ourselves better educated around the issues, how do you support legislation? How do you support advocacy efforts? How do you join boards or volunteer with institutions that are seeking to dismantle racism? What can you do to change things? So that's what I would say.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. It ties it back to what you were saying in the beginning of just like listening, but then adding the component of making sure that you're taking action behind what you're hearing and what you're listening to. So thank you so much, Paul. It was a pleasure. And we're going to continue the conversation. I'm going to open it up to the audience now. And Diana, I think you have been watching to see what questions have been coming in.
Yeah, thank you, Ty. Thank you, Paul. And thank you, everybody, for your wonderful comments. I'm definitely talking about how, Paul, you've been reframing things so beautifully. And so we definitely have a lot of questions here. I'm going to start with some questions that came in from the registration form. How have you been able to balance your activism and your career? Did you ever find yourself blurring the lines, or is this even a factor?
It's not a factor anymore, but I am at a different point in my career where I'm able to do that, right? I have built my professional equity, capital, social capital within my organization, where I'm able to say and do what I want pretty much, right? I have the ability to do so and have really open and honest conversations with my leaders, with my CEO. The fact that I report to my CEO gives me a lot of standing within the organization. But years ago, and this is going back now, when my days at Bank of America, Fleet Bank, before it became Bank of America, I made a decision at that point that I was never going to compromise who I was anymore, and that I was only going to work for organizations that could fully take me as I am, right? Because I was tired of code switching. And for those of you who know the term, I was tired of trying to be someone who I was not in corporate settings, and trying to, pretend that I wasn't, who I was, in the sense that I'm a big man, right? I'm 6'6", and so I was always trying to shrink myself to not be intimidating. I was sort of, trying to be collegial because, I wanted to belong. And I was like, why am I twisting myself in pretzels here to try to make someone feel comfortable with my presence? And so, I decided long ago to not do that. So that's why I'm still at State Street, right? Because I can be an activist, I can be however people describe me. I don't necessarily think of myself as that, but I just speak what is my truth. I just say how it is, and if people like it, great. People don't like it, I keep it moving, right? I got job to do, I got work to do, and I got things to change. And so that either will take me as I am, or I will go somewhere else to find that career fulfillment, or I'll do my own thing, which I've done before as well. So I think that there's a certain freedom that I have now in my role and in my position in my career, where I can do that. And clearly not everyone can express themselves fully like that, but why not, right? You should be all in environments where you should be able to express yourself fully, and be embraced by that, because that brings about a different perspective that the organizations need. Thank you, Makeda.
Yes, thank you. Going back to reframing the conversation, how can we also reframe the public conversation to emphasize why equity matters beyond advancing justice for marginalized groups? That fostering diversity and belonging makes organizations smarter, more innovative, and more responsive to meeting real needs.
I think that's already happening. I think in corporate America, you hear that a lot now. You hear leaders talking about it from that perspective. I think that there's a realization that this is not about just values, but also value, as I mentioned earlier, and that companies, and that the better performing companies are those who are A, diverse, B, inclusive, C, where employees feel engaged and feel ownership, and feel embraced. And so that's, if you're not thinking in that way now in corporate, is what I do feel is missing is I don't necessarily hear that a lot from a lot of our leaders in government, outwardly, right? And there's still this partisan view of what equity is. And until we get all of us working together and speaking the same language, and that's why language is important, it's going to be hard to move the needle. It's going to be hard to get people understanding. We're going to be entrenched in our ideals and our beliefs, and it's going to be this us versus them mentality, continuum mentality. And by the way, right, why change the power structure that has worked so well for so many people for so long? I mean, what incentive is there to share power, right? Because we think of this in deficit terms, in terms of this is a pie that we all need to split, versus this is not a pie, right? We need to actually by paying people better, by inviting more people to take advantage of the economic opportunities, by putting more money in people's pockets, actually helps us all, right? Infuses activity into our economy. More people can buy houses, more people can buy cars. All of a sudden, economic prosperity is even better for all of us, right? There's studies that talk about that there's about, I think, a $10 million, $10 trillion gap because of pay equity, gender pay equity, right? And there's a similar gap because of racial pay equity that we're not taking advantage of. That's $10 trillion that's not circulating in our economy that we could all take advantage because of we can increase food security, health, economic outcomes, all these different things, and that's not happening because people feel that we can't share power, we can't figure things out more more equitably, I guess. So until we start doing that, until we start hearing our our leaders, both in federal, state, and local government, then we're not going to make a whole lot of progress.
Thank you. How are you thinking about measuring impact towards systemic change over just investment dollars? What advice would you give to others looking to do the same?
So I think that there's a misconception that I think of philanthropy as investing in communities, and when you invest in communities, you're actually dismantling the inequities and therefore the racist systems that put people in disadvantaged positions in the first place. So, this is not, and I'm talking specifically about how people fund, for example, not-for-profits, or people fund strategies. This is not a charity or a charitable endeavor, right? We're not looking at this as handouts or anything of the nature. We are investing in tried and true and proximate knowledge of things around the 4 pillars that I mentioned that are actually making a difference in our communities and making lives better for people. And whenever you do that, you're breaking through the inequities, right? And then therefore you're breaking through this systemic things that keep people in place. We are not, this $100 million, whenever we raise that $100 million, is barely going to put a dent in what needs to be done in order to right the inequities that have been put in place for so long. We know that, right? So it's not like NCF, the New Commonwealth Fund, is going to dismantle systemic racism. But what we hope to accomplish as part of that is to influence other, and we're already starting to do so, influence other funders to think of funding differently, right? Or think of ways in which to make funding more equitable. And when you have, and I'll speak to my own corporate foundation, right? We give out close to $25-30 million a year in grants to communities. And now our foundation is pivoting to look at specifically issues of racial equity and social justice, right? That's systemically, right? And even if it's company by company, and other foundations like Eastern Bank Foundation, Tufts Health Plan, and with the combined new company now with Harvard Pilgrim and others, are looking at that and saying, hey, the New Commonwealth Fund is actually onto something here. Why is it? Can we analyze how we would give the money out, how we are invested in communities, and how we're investing enough in those communities that need it the most? And so, we don't have the answers, but it's a place to start. And if we can create systems and ecosystems that support that, I think that we're heading in the right direction.
All right, thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question. And so more psychologists are needed to get to help people get to the root of the long-term resentment underlying racism. People can't take accountability on their own. How do we transform these glossed over sensitivity trainings to include a real psychological probe to break racism down? And why are Caucasians never a group to be learned about in sensitivity trainings?
There's a deep question. So let me start by saying, how many of us voluntarily submit to some psychological testing or evaluation or counseling, right? Unless there's a crisis moment that we all experience, in our lives that sort of we have to deal with the trauma. So institutionally, that's what we need to do, right? We need to be able to give the tools to folks to deal with the trauma institutionally. There is a personal, and this is why accountability is so important. There's a personal accountability. I as a chief diversity inclusion officer of a 40,000 person organization, can't force everyone to go to counseling, right? But I also don't want to gloss over, inclusion and diversity trainings that are just sort of superficial, right? You have to get to the root cause of why people, the heart, the mind, right, and the hands, right, the action part of what needs to happen. So this is a combination of, yes, you have to have some skill sets embedded in the organization that actually go deeper into people's psyche, into how people can break through. And there's a responsibility that we have to provide those type of courses or that type of training. But there is a lot personally and individually. If you force me to do something that I'm not willing to ultimately accept and willing to work on, it's just not going to work, right? So that's why moments of reflection, sort of sitting back and understanding where you are, understanding we all are racist, right? Like, people kind of get like, oh my God, I'm not racist, right? I don't see color. I literally had someone send me an email the other day, say, Paul, I sent an email to the whole organization on Black History Month, and I addressed the issue of systemic racism, and I got a note back, which is one of the few notes I get from a colleague of mine, saying, Paul, and she used a Dr. Martin Luther King quote saying, only, darkness can drive out darkness, only light can. I'm paraphrasing. And it took me a while to respond because I was thinking about it. And she said, she mentioned the fact that her neighbor to the left is Mexican, her neighbor to the right is Black, and that she doesn't see them, she doesn't see the color in them. And, my answer to that is, that's great, right? That you think that because you think that you don't see color, that you're not racist. And the fact that you're not fully looking at those people as who they are and acknowledging their identity, right? Whatever the identity that they choose to own, is racist or is at least insensitive. So I get the good intention that you have, but there's a lot of deeper work that needs to happen. And that's not how I phrased my email back to her, by the way. So don't think I'm that harsh, but you have to make people realize and understand that this is hard work. This is not superficial. This is deep work, and is deep within us. And let's not even begin to think about how deep it is within the systems. And so it's a journey. It's not going to, you're not all of a sudden wake up tomorrow and feel that you have conquered this, because, even I make some huge boo-boos on a daily basis. So it's just something that we all need to endeavor to change and work hard at changing ourselves first, and then changing, the conditions around us.
Well, thank you. And on that, thank you, Ty. Thank you, Paul, for this fantastic discussion. And thank you, everybody, for your comments in the chat. This was truly incredibly knowledgeable and incredibly informative, and also just needed, period. Thank you so much. And thank you again, everyone, for joining today's event. You will be receiving a follow-up event email with a link to a survey to share your feedback to help us improve future events. And check out the Northeastern University Alumni YouTube channel, where we'll be posting the recording of this event in the next few business days. And thank you again. We look forward to seeing you. And truly thank you, Paul and Ty, for your time, energy, and just you today.
Thank you, Ty, Molly. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I really appreciate it.